Hi, and welcome to the fourth video in the series of videos for the optional projects, the P5JS projects in our class. In the first video, as you recall, we talked about where the data come from, the data source, the CSV file, the weather data, how it was collected. In the second video, we went through how within a P5JS program, you can load in that CSV file and iterate through it one row at a time. And in the third video, which is really one of the optional projects, I showed how to make a scrolling graph that you can extend and enhance that shows the data from the CSV file, the weather data, in simulated real time. It goes along, it shows you day by day and it scrolls. In this video, I'll show you another way, not so much to visualize, but to, let's say, audiolize the data, the weather data, by using sound instead of graphics to represent what's happening from moment to moment. So to do that, we need to look at yet another sketch, which I'll share in just a moment, and we will try playing that and see how that works. So let me share my screen, and parts of this sketch will seem familiar to you, and I'm going to assume that you have seen the earlier sketches. So I'm not going to re-explain a number of the details here. I'll just try to explain the stuff that's unique to this sketch. There are a lot of comments in here. We'll go back to the comments because those have some suggestions for what you can do as a part of this project. But if we scroll down to um, line 43 through 46, that's actually a function of like a function you would have in Python that does a useful thing. If in order to make these data sound a little more musical, and you'll see in a moment what I mean because it sounds pretty strange, it's possible to force the audio tones to the nearest note, musical note on a scale. That's what this function does. You don't have to use this function. You can turn it on or off, but it's there if you want to use it. The preload function we talked about before loads the data from the CSV file. The setup function is very similar to what you've seen before. Figure out how many rows we loaded, print that, create a canvas to draw something on. This sketch does not inherently draw anything, but you can. And then line 62 is new. Line 62 instantiates a P5JS class called oscillator. An oscillator is literally something that makes a sound at a particular frequency. The sign, which is the argument to this oscillator, says make a pure tone, not a square wave, not a triangle wave, but just a pure tone. It's rather like the tone that a flute would make. There are a lot of options here, and I advise you to check those out in the P5JS documentation. Having instantiated, gotten an oscillator that we can work with, we can set the frequency, and we're going to set the frequency to represent the values that are read from the CSV file, from the temperature. So as the temperatures are read moment by moment from the CSV file, we'll produce a sound whose frequency is directly related to the temperature. So temperature goes up, the frequency goes up. Temperature goes down, the frequency goes down. I've set the amplitude to this value here. That's how loud it is. Even so, if you're wearing headphones to watch this, you might be advised to take them off at this point because it can get loud. And Zoom is going to do strange things to the audio. So it actually will sound better somewhat when you run it, or at least more consistent than it will under Zoom, where Zoom's automatic volume control is just going to have a fit in a minute. The draw method, remember, that's the one that's repeated over and over again in the P5JS idiom. The draw method is very similar to the ones in the other classes, other projects, other videos. I rescaled centigrade to Fahrenheit just because it's convenient. I mapped the frequencies so that the relatively small range of temperature that occurs in my yard never gets colder than, in this sample, than 30, never gets hotter than 90 until we get to summer, into a range between 500 and 2000 hertz. So those are frequencies kind of in the middle range of human hearing. Below 500 sort of gets down to the bass tones. Above 2000 or 3000 gets up into the higher frequencies. Most speech is concentrated in this range from 500 to 2000. You can change these values as you like. I get the date time from the file, just as in all the other sketches. Useful thing to have, and you'll see why in a moment. And I'm actually trying to take that frequency and to make it sound a little more musical, because as you'll see, it sounds pretty strange. I'm actually forcing the generated frequency, the computed frequency, onto a musical scale by converting it to a MIDI value and then converting the MIDI value back to a frequency. There might be a better way to do this, but this does seem to work. And it makes it slightly more musical, not a lot. Last step, we set the frequency of the oscillator to so it will play the note that we've created now, and we log the value of the date and the frequency just so we can see what's going on. So I'm going to run it now. Again, bear in mind, it's Zoom is going to have a lot of difficulty and heartache with these tones, so the volume is going to go in and out, and some things that are not actually going to happen when you run the sketch. So here's a brief sample. Okay, that's probably enough for you to get the idea, right? As the temperature goes up, which you can see down here in the bottom, like 76.82 degrees, the frequency that is played goes up. So that gives you a way of representing the temperature that's not really visual, but audible. Might conceivably be of some use if you were producing a program for someone who was hearing impaired. Sorry, not hearing impaired, visually impaired, in which case they could probably better interpret the audible tones than they can visual display. So that's basically what the program that I'm going to provide you, the starter program, does. Your job is to enhance this and expand this in some interesting ways. Now, this project is probably mostly going to appeal to you if you already have some background in audio or in music. I have no background in music, but I am familiar with a lot of audio effects. And so the vocabulary here, if you're not familiar with the vocabulary, you might find this one challenging. But if you are, you may be able to take this a lot farther than I have, because your knowledge of representing things in music is probably much greater than mine. So here's some ideas for the project. I'm using a sine wave, which is a pure tone. You can try a triangle or square wave or another waveform. Those have a different timbre. Timbre is a term that Timbre. That's the term that refers to the quality of the note, the number of the harmonics and the overtones that are present in the note. Square waves will sound very ragged, and so will triangle waves or sawtooth waves. You can add an envelope. My notes just instantaneously change from one value to the next value to the next value. In fact, you could probably hear a little click. If you add an envelope, that's a variation, a programmatic variation in volume that you can set up so that the notes will begin, sustain, and end in a certain way. And that's, again, a P5JS function. Look it up in the reference and see what you think. You can add lots of interesting effects. One is a phaser. You probably heard the phaser effect in music. It's achieved by changing the relative phase of stereo audio signal, and it makes the signal appear to move left and right in headphones. It's kind of an interesting idea. Um, this sequence has not only temperature, which is what I was playing, but also humidity, and also rain and wind. So you might be able to represent rain not as a continuous tone, because it doesn't happen very often in these data in the winter. Maybe you could make some kind of percussive sounds or some kind of white noise or something that represents rain to play when you encounter rain in the data set. So think about that. Wind, maybe there's a sound effect for wind you could play. Again, whatever makes sense to you to represent wind. the wind data in here, again, the wind comes and goes, so it won't be a continuous tone like you heard with temperature, humidity. It would be, it would sound different. Uh, Add some filtering. There's all kinds of filtering. I put a URL there you can look at that will change the way the tones sound. Now, the sine wave is pretty much a pure tone, but if you use something like a square wave or some other waveform, adding a low pass filter or a high pass filter will change the way it sounds. There are lots of other effects. You could add reverb. I'm not sure what that sense that makes, but if you use some sort of percussive sound, a drum-like sound for rain, let's say, reverb probably would have a marked effect on the sound. You could make an FFT display, fast Fourier transform, to accompany the sound. If you've seen those are the little bar graphs that bounce up and down. They show you how many high frequencies and how many low frequencies are present at any one given point in time. You can find some examples in P5JS that you can probably warp to fit this. You could use some actual musical effects for these data. Now we step out of something I have any understanding of into something that maybe some of you have a much greater understanding of. P5JS has, in addition to the ability to create tones, as we're doing, it also has the ability to play a sequence of notes or to store a sequence of notes and repeat them and that kind of thing. Maybe you could store a chunk of these temperature sounds, put it to some beat and play it back. I don't know. What you're looking for here is there's something called a P5JS phrase, which is I think kind of like a bar of music, and a P5JS part, which is a subdivision of that. So a phrase is composed of parts, and parts have all kinds of interesting characteristics that I don't really understand. You could use P5JS Pulse. There's a pulse generator to create PWM, pulse width modulation effects, and change the pulse width modulation in response to a second measurement in the data stream. If you change the width of pulses in a PWM stream, you get a change in tonality. The different width pulses produce different overtones, so you get a different sound. And you could actually change the tonality using PWM at the same time you're changing the frequency. So you could have the humidity change the sound and the temperature change the frequency or something like that. There are all kinds of effects that are gotten from analog synthesizers. Now, originally, analog synthesizers like the ARP and the Moog were really the only way to create electronic music. Now, of course, it's created digitally, but there's still a lot of diehard folks out there who really like making analog synthesizers and playing them. And I've seen quite a few impressive ones at maker fairs. If you look into the literature of analog synthesizers, you'll find all kinds of effects that can be now created digitally. And maybe you can mimic some of those or apply one or more of those to these weather data streams. P5JS has text to speech. So you could actually have your sketch enunciate the date and time periodically, so you know where you are in this apparently endless sequence of notes. You could speak the date and time. That might be interesting. I haven't tried that, but it says it works. And in general, you could use your extreme music skills if you have them, or at least your imagination if you don't, to come up with something surprising. I would really like to see what folks can come up with here, because I think there's a possibility for some really interesting stuff that I really haven't thought of. So you could and last but not least, combine this sketch with a scrolling graph sketch, which is very, very similar. You'll notice this when you look at the videos, and you could have both show the graph and play the notes at the same time. So that would actually be doing both projects, but that's okay. If that's what you want to do, that's great. So that's essentially the kind of things. It's very open-ended. So if you come up with your own idea, just tell me what your idea is, and we'll try to make that happen. And I'm looking forward to getting some really interesting stuff from you on this. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and basically say, so you may not want to attempt this project if you are completely at sea with the terminology. If you don't know what a sine wave is or anything about how sound is produced, you can certainly learn it. There's a reference as a link, a very good link in the comments we were just looking at that because it has a long background on digital audio, digital music, the history, how it came about, where it is now, and how it's done programmatically. So in the same way that there's generative art, there's folks who use processing P5JS and other programs to produce art, kind of like the shapes and stuff that you produced in earlier projects. You can do the same thing for audio. It's just that most people are more familiar with the visual than they are with the audio section. But I think you might find it interesting. And of course, contemporary music has lots of electronic effects in it. And maybe you can figure out how to reproduce some of those. And instead of using them just purely to convey entertainment, actually, in this case, convey some information. So that's the idea. Feel free to get in touch with me with questions or whatever you want to do. And I look forward to seeing something interesting from you on this project if you choose to do it. Thanks.